A Song for Silas by Lori Wick. Chapter 31. Everyone spent the next few days working on Mac and Julia's house. They stayed nights at Luke and Christine's, but every minute of daylight was spent airing and cleaning. It was amazing how fast the smell of smoke had infiltrated everything. The first night Mac and Julia were back in their own home and the children put to bed, Mac turned his full attention to his wife for really the first time since the fire. He had sensed all along something was wrong, but with taking care of the house and the running of the farm, he'd had no time to talk with her. "How are you doing?" They were sitting in the kitchen, each with a cup of coffee, and Mac was studying his wife's face with deep concentration. "I'm fine," Julia answered with a small smile. The truth was that her head and back ached, but this, she was convinced, was due to the last few days. "You don't seem fine." "I don't?" Julia looked truly puzzled. "No, you don't." Mac's voice was kind but firm. "Well, Mac, I feel a little achy and tired, but that's understandable after all that's gone on lately. Julia's voice told him she felt all of this was hardly worth mentioning. Mac looked doubtful, and Julia reached for his hand. "I'm fine, honestly." Mac continued to look at her in unbelief, but he let the matter drop. Over the next few days, Mac kept a close watch on the woman he loved. She looked pale to him, but when he tried to talk to her about it, she burst into tears and said she was still a little upset from the fire. Anxiously, he watched her, but he felt helpless since she seemed to think nothing was out of the ordinary. Mac prayed and tried to leave the matter in God's hands, hoping he would know if and when to step in. The time to step in came 10 days after they returned to the house. Mac was in the barn when the boys came running from the house to tell him their mother was on the floor. "She just fell over, Pa," Calvin said with fear as they followed their running father toward the house. Julia was just coming to when Mac ran into the kitchen. He went down on the floor beside her and supported her as she tried to sit up. Her face was chalk white. Julia opened her mouth to speak, but Mac cut in, his voice sharp with fear. "If you dare tell me you're fine, Julia, I'll throttle you." That was exactly what she had been about to say, and dutifully closed her mouth. Actually, she felt a bit nauseous, and was glad to be still. "Are you okay, Mom?" Charles's voice quivered with his question. Julia turned to see her sons kneeling beside her, tears in their eyes. She started to reassure them, but Mac stepped in. "Just as soon as your Uncle Mark sees her, we'll know." "Oh, Mac, I don't need—" "Not a word, Julia. Boys, go get the horses out. We're going to town." The boys had never moved faster to do his bidding. Leaving Julia on the couch, Mac and the boys hitched the horses to the wagon. He threatened her with dire consequences if he found her off the couch or even sitting up. Mac carried Julia to the wagon and tried to get her to lay down in the back, but she adamantly refused. Mac gave in just to get her to town as soon as possible. Mac moved restlessly about Suzanne's elegant living room as she sat helplessly and watched him. Julia had been with Mark in his office for over 30 minutes, and Mac was at his wit's end. Inside the office, Mark looked at his sister, a little surprised she didn't already know what he was about to tell her. "Julia, you're pregnant." "I'm what?" "You're going to have a baby." Mark enunciated the words carefully as though speaking to a slow-witted child. "But that's impossible." Mark's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline on that statement, but Julia rushed on. I just never got pregnant after Charlie, and I just assumed that I couldn't." Julia's voice trailed off rather helplessly as she tried to take it all in. She was as surprised as Mark that she and Mac had not noticed any of the signs, for they had been there, staring them right in the face. "Mac!" Julia's next thoughts were of her husband. She had to tell him right away. The door leading from the office into the living room opened slowly, and Mac's entire body tensed as he watched his wife walk out, followed by her brother. His peripheral vision caught Mark leading Suzanne from the room, but his eyes were locked on Julia. She walked toward him and without forewarning said, "I'm going to have a baby." Mac's eyes closed, and he felt as if all the air had left his body. He stood a moment, trying to put air back into his lungs. "Thank you, God. Thank you, God," his heart kept repeating. When at last he opened his eyes, he pulled Julia tenderly into his arms. Julia felt him tremble, and her heart broke. He had been so frightened. The boys found their parents in this embrace, and even though it was not an unusual sight, approached carefully. When they broke apart, Calvin said, "Uncle Mark says you're okay and that you have good news." Julia broke the news to them with tears in her eyes. When Mark and Sue heard shouts and laughter from the living room, they knew it was all right to return. What followed was a joyous chaos of laughter and tears. Mark took Julia back into his office to tell her how to take care of herself and things to watch for. She had never fainted when pregnant with the boys, and he intended to keep a careful eye on her. He insisted Mac join them since he wanted his orders followed to the letter. A while later, Mac headed the wagon for Grandma M's. Even with the boys fighting in the back over who would tell her the news, he thought this was probably the most beautiful day God had ever created.